Workplace exploitation eats you alive from the inside out. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Republic had a specific system for exactly this problem. They called it the architecture of Auctoritas, Dignitas, and Fides. Paradox is that the Romans never taught this as a way to fight back against bad bosses or toxic coworkers. They taught it as a way to command yourself, because a man who cannot govern his own boundaries inevitably becomes the property of someone else. You know the sensation, the tightness in your throat when you agree to another unpaid hour, the sinking feeling when your boundaries evaporate, the second someone raises their voice. To understand why this ancient system works, we have to look at what happens when you try to do it the modern way. And today, the story of Robert Jackson will prove it to you. Robert Jackson is 30 years old, standing in the perpetual cold draft of a Detroit auto shop. The air here tastes of iron and motor oil, heavy and unyielding. Fluorescent lights buzz above the cracked concrete floor, casting a sickly pale hue over the hydraulic lifts that never seem to stop groaning. Frost creeps along the edges of the bay doors, a stubborn reminder that the Michigan winter does not care about deadlines. Robert works with his hands, fixing machines that other people break, but the physical exhaustion is nothing compared to the weight he carries in his chest. A faded union card hangs on the pegboard above his workstation, next to a rusted toolbox he bought when he was 22. These objects are supposed to represent progress, but today they just look like artifacts of stagnation. On the break room table sits a worn notebook, its pages filled with ASA certification study guides and frantic sketches for his own independent shop. The pages are dog-eared and coffee-stained, untouched for weeks. The ambition is there, but the execution is a void. Robert has tried to fix this. He has consumed the modern solutions, downloading boundary-setting apps and listening to assertiveness podcasts during his commute. Last Tuesday, the shop foreman slapped a transmission rebuild on his bench at 4:45 in the afternoon. Robert opened his assertiveness app, breathed in, and tried to use the sandwich technique he learned from a YouTube video. He said he understood the urgency, but he had to leave, and maybe they could hand it to the night shift. The foreman slapped him on the back, said the schedule was tight, and walked away. Robert stayed until 9 o'clock that night. The modern hack failed because it relied on an external script, a verbal bandage placed over an internal wound. Looking at the grease under his fingernails, Robert concluded that the problem must be him. Maybe he just does not have the spine for this industry. Maybe he is just built to be the guy who stays late. Late one night, while scrolling through his phone in the dark, a local community center flyer appeared on his screen. It advertised a lecture on Stoic philosophy and ancient Roman leadership. He usually ignored these things, but the sleep deprivation and the ache in his lower back pushed him to click the register. Robert entered the community center the following Sunday for all the wrong reasons. His truck was in the shop anyway, and his cousin, who was supposed to go with him, had bailed, leaving Robert with nothing but a lingering boredom and a stubborn refusal to spend another day staring at his apartment walls. He walked in wearing his work boots, the soles still tracking a faint dusting of shop grit onto the polished hardwood floor. The room was a shock to his system. It was completely quiet. No buzzing televisions, no clattering tools, no relentless hum of machinery, just the low rhythmic hum of a space heater in the corner and the faint dry smell of old books and cedar. It felt like a sanctuary, entirely removed from the chaos of his daily life. Standing at the front of the room was a man named Arthur. He did not pace or fidget. He stood perfectly still by a chalkboard, his shoulders squared and his hands resting comfortably at his sides. His posture was vertical, unbothered, radiating a quiet and immovable authority. Robert took a seat in the back row, crossing his arms. Arthur watched him. A long silence stretched across the room, thick enough to feel. Arthur walked down the aisle, stopping right beside Robert's chair. He looked down at the oil stains on Robert's hands. "You spend your days fixing machines other people break," Arthur said. The silence returned, pressing against the walls. "But who fixes you when you let them break you?" Robert opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wanted to say he could handle it, but the emptiness of the words choked him. Arthur looked at him, waiting. "What do you actually own in that shop?" Robert could not answer. He wanted to say his tools, but he knew the truth. The shop owned his time. What do you actually own in your workplace? Arthur turned away and walked back to the front. Come back Tuesday, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the silence. Bring a piece of work you did not finish for someone else. Leave it at the door. Arthur began to dismantle everything Robert thought he knew about surviving the workplace. Being a victim, Arthur explained, is not about what others do to you. It is about the absence of Auctoritas. Auctoritas is not loud. It is not about shouting or dominating a room. It is the gravity that pulls respect toward you, the undeniable presence of a man who governs himself completely. Without it, you are just a body taking up space, waiting to be moved by whoever speaks the loudest. The urgency of this lesson could not be clearer. The longer you operate without internal command, the more your brain wires itself for subservience, turning you into a permanent instrument for someone else's will. Arthur introduced the concept of Dignitas. He called it the internal furnace. Most men try to fuel their worth with external validation, waiting for a boss to approve or a paycheck to confirm their value. But external validation is the fuel that burns out the moment the approval stops. Dignitas is the furnace that never cools, powered entirely by your own assessment of your worth. Robert decided to test this on Wednesday. The foreman approached him at noon, dropping a parts inventory list on his bench and telling him to skip lunch to get it done. Robert felt the familiar spike of anxiety, the instinct to nod and comply. Instead, he looked at the foreman and said no. He was taking his lunch. The foreman scoffed, muttered something about team players, and walked away. Robert sat in his truck, eating a cold sandwich, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a rush of triumph. He had won, but the victory was fragile. 2 days later, a customer screamed at him over a billing discrepancy that was not his fault. Robert tried to summon his Dignitas, but the furnace sputtered. The customer's aggression was too loud, too overwhelming. Robert caved, apologizing profusely and discounting the bill just to make the yelling stop. Driving home, he realized the flaw. Dignitas cannot be a shield you pick up only when you feel brave. It has to be the ground you stand on, independent of the volume of the world around you. Arthur listened to this failure without surprise. The problem, he told Robert, is the uncertainty of destination. You cannot hold a boundary if you do not know exactly where you are walking. This is where Fides enters. Fides is reliability, but not to your employer. It is reliability to yourself. It requires micro-actions. Not grand stands in the middle of the shop floor, but tiny invisible pacts you make with your own word. Arthur gave him a simple assignment. Leave the shop exactly at 5 o'clock for 1 week. No excuses, no staying 10 minutes to finish up, not to prove a point to the foreman, but to prove a point to himself. The Romans understood Fides as a binding force, a sacred contract, but modern neuroscience reveals exactly why this practice changes the brain. When you repeatedly violate your own boundaries to please others, your dorsal anterior cingulate cortex fires, signaling social pain. The brain registers this as rejection, but the true damage is that the rejection is coming from yourself. This triggers a chronic stress response, elevating cortisol levels and actively shrinking the prefrontal cortex, the exact region of the brain required for assertiveness and long-term planning. By keeping micropacks, by leaving at 5 o'clock every single day, you rewire the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You build what neuroscientists call self-integrity. The Roman concept of Fides was not just a moral philosophy, it was a literal blueprint for neural integration, restoring the very brain function required to hold your ground. 6 months passed. Robert was different. His posture in the shop had changed. He no longer hunched over his bench, rushing to meet impossible deadlines. He clocked out at 5. He spoke clearly, without the apologetic hesitation that used to plague his voice. He was studying for his AA certifications again, the notebook no longer abandoned. But he still worked under the same foreman in the same shop. He was managing his victimhood, but he had not escaped the environment that constantly tested it. He had the Dignitas and the Fides, but he lacked the ultimate Auctoritas to change his actual station in life. One afternoon, he saw a help-wanted sign across the street. A new specialty shop was opening, looking for a lead mechanic. Robert had the skills, but he stared at the application on his phone, the old wiring fighting the new philosophy. Could he really lead? Before he could decide, his phone rang. It was his current boss. Robert was at his bench, meticulously organizing a socket set he had already organized twice that morning. It was fake work, a way to look busy while avoiding the foreman. His boss walked up, the sound of his heavy boots cutting through the shop noise. The boss got straight to the point. The shop was losing the night shift premium pay, effective immediately, and Robert was being moved to the night shift at the standard day rate. The ambient noise of the shop seemed to vanish. The groaning hydraulic lifts faded into the background. A cold knot formed in Robert's stomach, followed by a tight, constricting band wrapping around his chest. He needed that premium. It was the exact money he had earmarked to pay for his final ASE exam, and the deposit on the small garage space he had been secretly eyeing on the east side. Without it, the timeline for his own shop collapsed entirely. Robert swallowed hard, looking at his boss. "I will figure it out," Robert said, promising to handle the schedule change. But as the words left his mouth, the hollow echo of every empty promise he had ever made in this shop rang in his ears. His long history of workplace compliance made this new promise empty. Robert drove straight to the community center. The streets of Detroit were slick with freezing rain, the headlights of his truck cutting through the dark. He found Arthur in the back room, sweeping the already immaculate hardwood floor. Robert stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, the cold air still clinging to his work jacket. He told Arthur about the night shift, the lost premium, and the collapsed timeline for his own shop. Arthur stopped sweeping. He leaned the broom against the wall and looked at Robert. "This is the real war," Arthur said. Robert stared at the floor. Arthur stepped closer. "Panic is a reaction to their power. Purpose is a declaration of your own." Robert looked up. The pivot question from that first night echoed in his mind. What do you actually own in that shop? The answer was suddenly clear. Nothing. He owned nothing there because he had never claimed ownership of himself. Arthur held his gaze. "You do not negotiate for your dignity. You enforce it. Hand in your notice tomorrow." Robert felt the ground shift beneath him. The thought of walking away from a paycheck, even a diminishing one, was terrifying. Arthur did not wait for a response. "Do it before you talk yourself out of it. Leave the keys and walk." The following night was the longest of Robert Jackson's life. He sat on the cold concrete floor of his rented garage, a space barely large enough to hold his tools, let alone an operating business. The space heater in the corner hummed, fighting a losing battle against the Michigan chill that seeped through the rusted seams of the overhead door. The smell of parts solvent and old cardboard filled the damp air. Robert stared at the wall. His inner furnace, his Dignitas, was lit, but it was burning low, sputtering under the weight of his fear. He had quit. No safety net, no lead mechanic job secured yet, just a box of tools and a head full of doubt. He reached for a worn socket wrench, his hands still bearing the ingrained grease of 10 years of compliance. The old voice returned, whispering that he was a fool, that he would lose his apartment, that he should beg for his job back. But the small win was right in front of him. He had quit. He had kept the pact. He had chosen Fides over survival. That single action was evidence. He was not a man who just took orders anymore. Arthur had warned him about the difference between doing and being. Doing is handing in your keys because you are angry. Being is standing in the cold because you know you will never belong to someone else. Every second he sat in that freezing garage, refusing to dial the foreman's number, was a vote for the new identity. The accretion of these votes was slow, agonizing, and entirely invisible to the outside world. But inside the brain of Robert Jackson, the neural pathways of compliance were weakening, and the circuits of autonomy were firing, demanding energy, demanding he build something from nothing. 3 months later, the crisis had passed. Robert had not magically opened his own shop, but the cumulative weight of his small actions had forged a new reality. He took a temporary contract at a specialty restoration garage across town. The pay was less, but the hours were his. He passed his final AAC certification on a Tuesday morning, paying for it with the money he saved by no longer buying the convenience store lunches he used to grab during his rushed, compliant shifts. One evening, the lead mechanic at the restoration shop, an older man named Gus, watched Robert methodically cleaning his station. Gus tossed him a rag. "You carry yourself differently, Jackson, like you actually want to be here." Robert caught the rag, nodding quietly. He finally understood the missing piece. The why had always been external before. He wanted his own shop to prove he was not a victim. But now, the why was internal. He wanted his own shop because that was the natural extension of the man he had become. Arthur visited the shop a week later. He stood in the doorway, observing the organized tools and the straight posture of the mechanic. The external urgency will fade, Arthur told him. The boss will stop testing you. The real test is when the war is quiet. Do you still build when no one is attacking? The shop fell silent. The crisis of the night shift demotion was a distant memory. The frantic, adrenaline-fueled push to pass his exams and find new work was over. Robert was employed, respected, and financially stable. The warm comfort of routine began to settle over the garage like a heavy blanket. The radiators hissed, providing a thick, drowsy heat that made the muscles relax and the mind slow down. It would be so easy to just stay here. The restoration shop was safe. Gus liked him. The customers did not yell. The foreman was reasonable. Robert would sit in the break room, the afternoon sun warming the linoleum floor, and the old temptations would creep back in. The soft voice that said he had done enough, that he could just be a mechanic here forever, that the dream of his own place was too much work, too much risk. The sensory pull of this comfort was immense. It was the warmth of the herd, the safety of the known. But then Robert recalled the Roman legionary. Arthur had explained that a legionary did not just fight battles. A legionary built roads and fortifications in the silent, boring hours of peacetime. The discipline was not for the clash of swords. The discipline was for the quiet Tuesday afternoon when there was absolutely no reason to keep working except that the work demanded to be done. Robert put down his coffee. He walked out of the warm break room and back to his bench. He opened his notebook and began sketching the layout of his own shop, calculating the square footage, the cost of the lifts, and the wiring. He chose to work in silence. Modern psychology refers to this as the process of identity consolidation. The prefrontal cortex solidifies new behavioral patterns not during moments of high stress, but during the quiet lulls of routine. The dopamine system recalibrates, finding reward in the action itself rather than the panic of survival. Identity is built in the silence of routine, where the only witness is the self. 3 years passed. The east side of Detroit was not an easy place to open a business, but the sign above the bay doors read Jackson Automotive. It was a modest operation, 2 lifts, a small waiting area, but it was his. Robert stood in the center of the garage, the morning light streaming through the clean, frost-free windows. He looked at the space with a quiet gratitude that held no resentment for the years of exploitation. Those years had been the crucible that forged the system. Without the foreman taking his time, Robert would have never discovered the urgency of Auctoritas. A delivery driver dropped off a case of motor oil, pausing to look around the shop. "You are a quiet guy," the driver said, "but you are always in motion." Robert simply signed the clipboard and went back to work. He walked over to his main toolbox. It was the same rusted box he had bought when he was 22, but it had been scrubbed, repainted, and rebuilt. He opened the top drawer and pulled out his old union card from the first shop. It was faded and coffee-stained. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it gently in the trash. He did not need the artifact of his stagnation anymore. The system was inside him now. You watched the story of Robert Jackson because you recognized the sensation. The tightness in the throat, the sinking feeling when the boundary evaporates. You are sitting in your own version of that cold Detroit garage, wondering if the problem is you, if you just lack the spine for this world. The Romans understood that workplace victimhood is not a personality flaw, it is a signal. It is the alarm bell ringing in a mind that has been disconnected from its own internal command. Auctoritas, Dignitas, and Fides are not ancient history. They are the exact neurobiological architecture required to stand your ground in a world that profits from your compliance. The system works, but it requires you to answer one question first. What is the one boundary you will keep tomorrow, not to prove a point to them, but to prove a point to yourself? Answer that in the comments below. If you want to see more systems like this, subscribe to this channel. The war for your autonomy is just beginning.